All right, welcome back. We're gonna talk about egoism in this video, and then on Monday we will wrap up our discussion of egoism with a focus on a specific kind of egoism known as hedonism, or hedonistic egoism, or egoistic hedonism. Our new topic that we started this week, and unfortunately we're had to cancel class on Wednesday, and I apologize for that, is ethics, study of right and wrong. And before we can even get into some of the bigger topics about what is right and what is wrong, and is there a right and wrong, it would be good to first discuss whether human beings like us are even capable of being motivated by right and wrong. In other words, when we act, are we just out for ourselves, even when we seem to be doing things that benefit other people? Are we capable of doing the right thing for its own sake? Egoism, broadly, is the thesis that we are not capable of doing the wrong thing, doing the right thing for its own sake. And we're going to try to be a little more precise about that here and distinguish between two versions of egoism: psychological egoism, which is going to be our focus, and ethical egoism. So our focus is psychological egoism. Psychological egoism is a descriptive claim. So psychological egoism does not tell us anything about how we ought to behave, or what the right thing is to do, or what kinds of desires are morally appropriate. Psychological egoism is silent on all of those interesting and important ethical questions. Psychological egoism simply says, here's the way human beings are, like it or not. Human beings at bottom are motivated by self-interest. Ultimately, everything we do, if we ask sufficiently probative why questions, why did you do that? What motivated you? Eventually, we will get down to a egoistic or self-centered answer. This includes, and the reason it's relevant for ethics and morality, moral behavior. We do things that we consider to be virtuous sometimes, or at the very least, we do things that we think of as being beneficial for others. The egoist, the psychological egoist, says, our reasons for example, driving our friend to the airport when they need it, if we're honest, ultimately have to do with the ways in which we think driving our friends to the airport is going to redound to our own benefit in the long run. You don't really care about that person for their own sake. You may care about them, you may care about helping them, but the reason that you want to care about them, the reason that you want to help them, is that you think that doing so is an effective and appropriate means toward achieving something for yourself. That's psychological egoism. It's a very general claim. We're going to look at some arguments for psychological egoism. Some of them are not great arguments, some of them are a little better, but the attraction of the theory at bottom, maybe you can already sense it, is its simplicity. It's a very simple and very broad diagnosis of what motivates human beings. We know that sometimes we're selfish, and egoism says we're really always selfish. And to the extent that we think we're not, we're deceiving ourselves. That really at bottom is the simplicity of the theory is a lot of its attraction. Ethical egoism is a normative claim, or a prescriptive claim. So whereas psychological egoism says, hey, here's how you're set up. You can't be motivated by anything for its own sake except your own self-interest. Ethical egoism goes a step further and says, like, I'm not sure how you're set up, but here's what you ought to do. You ought to care about yourself at bottom. Ultimately, according to the ethical egoist, we are obligated to pursue our own self-interest, even at the expense of the interests of others. I mentioned in class that ethical egoism is not very popular. That all by itself is not a reason to not believe it, but it can sometimes be an indicator that perhaps the reasons for it are lacking. We're not going to talk much about ethical egoism. Our focus instead is going to be on PE, or psychological egoism. Okay, so psychological egoism, although it is a contemporary philosophical, ethical, and sort of psychological, to some extent empirical, thesis, it has ancient roots. For as long as there have been philosophers and thinkers, people who think about human beings, there have been people who have articulated and defended the idea that we are selfish in some basic way. I had you read Republic Book 2 because it's a classic and very influential statement of something that comes close to psychological egoism. The Ring of Gyges thought experiment that Glaucon floats at the beginning of Book 2 it is difficult to find a more influential passage in much of the ancient Western canon. Difficult to find a passage that's as influential on the subsequent development of ethics as this passage is. So, beginning of Book 2 in the Republic, Socrates, Glaucon, and Glaucon's brother Adimantus are having a discussion about justice, by which, for us, we can suppose that they mean roughly something like what we mean by morality, right? Moral rightness. And the question arises, what kind of good is justice? There are different kinds of goods, or values, or ways for things to be desirable, is another way to put it. Broadly, the two types of categories are things that are desirable for their own sake, and things that are desirable for the sake of other things. So this distinction is sometimes couched as a distinction between things that are intrinsically good and things that are extrinsically good. You can put it that way as well. The idea is that we're very familiar with the phenomenon of wanting something, but only because of its consequences, or only because it can get us something else. Money is a paradigm case of something that is desirable, but only in virtue of the fact that money can get you other things you want. If you just got money and weren't able to do anything else with it, for example, like, I don't know, currencies that are defunct, then it's worthless. And it has value, yes, to the extent that money has value, but its value is entirely derivative upon the value of that which it can buy you. Likewise, many of the things that money can buy you have this feature of being valuable or desirable, but only for the sake of something else. Ultimately, much of the value of a house is in the shelter that it gives you. Now, you might think maybe there's some aesthetic features of a house that are desirable for their own sake. I don't know, maybe. But many of the material belongings that we have and care about, we care about because of what they get us. The idea of something that is intrinsically good or intrinsically valuable is the idea of something that, if it exists, is something we care about regardless of the consequences it brings, for its own sake. These are broadly the two kinds of goods. And there's a third category, as we'll see in a second, of things that maybe fall into both categories, of things we both want for their own sake and because of the good consequences they bring. So which category does justice fall into, according to Socrates? Glaucon asks Socrates. And Socrates puts justice in this category of, this sort of third category of something that is both intrinsically good and extrinsically good. How can this be? Well, his thought is like justice or morality gets you social accolades, for example. and may even get you positions of high honor. Maybe it'll get you public office to be good. Those are consequences of justice. That's not justice itself. But Socrates alleges, and this is really crucial, he says, justice or morality is also intrinsically good. Even if we removed all of those contingent external desirable qualities that or consequences of justice, Socrates says, we still would desire justice for its own sake. It both brings about good things and is good in and of itself. Now, the claim that justice is desirable for its own sake is the controversial claim that Socrates makes here, that Glaucon then challenges. Glaucon's challenge is this: do we really value, or do we really desire, justice or morality for its own sake? It's nice to say that. Sounds nice. May even be that you may think that sometimes the things you do fit that description. But Glaucon says, not so fast, not so fast. It's easy to trick yourself into thinking you care about justice for its own sake, when really it's the other goods you stand to gain by being just that's motivating you. So why does Glaucon make this suggestion? Well, he makes three distinct claims that are interrelated. One, he tells a story about the origins of justice. And those of you who've read Thomas Hobbes and know about some more modern political theory will recognize his description of the origins of justice as something like Hobbes's discussion of the transition from the so-called state of nature, or all versus all, into the state of into a state of organized society in which justice becomes a kind of contract between the weak to ward off the strong. All of that is super interesting, but the claim that that we care most about for purposes of discussion of psychological egoism is his second claim, which is whatever the origins and nature of justice are, he makes a psychological claim and a prediction. Yes, we behave justly, or we do moral things to one another. Of course we do. If you've ever given your friend a present, that was a just moral thing. But he says the only reason ultimately you do it is not because it's good in and of itself, but because it's necessary. Necessary for what? Well, necessary for bringing about goods for you. So in other words, Glaucon says, justice is not really an intrinsic good. We only behave morally because we're forced, so to speak, to do so by external circumstances. One way to understand what Glaucon's claiming here is that he, in effect, is defending a version of psychological egoism. Okay, so his defense of this claim rests on this story, which you can think of as not just a nice little story, but as pointing to something deeper. And I invite you to come up with your own versions of the story that maybe you might think more compelling than this silly one. The Ring of Gyges is a story of Gyges of Lydia, who's this shepherd who comes across a magical ring. It's a little bit like hobbits and Lord of the Rings. Puts on the ring and it makes him invisible. Pretty quickly, Gyges of Lydia realizes that because he can't be seen, if he behaves justly or morally, he'll gain no rewards for his just behavior. And if he behaves unjustly, or if he pursues his own self-interest at the ruthless expense of the interests of others, he won't be punished. He can't be caught because he can't be seen. He won't be treated as a immoral pariah by society because no one knows that he's the one who's taking the loaves of bread or killing the guards in the throne room as he's plotting to eventually take over the kingdom. People don't know that he's doing these immoral things, so he's not held to account socially for doing them. Glaucon says, and this is the way the story of Gyges of Lydia progresses, Gyges very quickly turns to the greatest kind of immorality. He kills the king, takes the queen against her will, sits on the throne, and rules the kingdom. Kind of usurpation of power, an ultimate perversion of justice in this society. You can imagine probably he begins to rule as a tyrant, because the people, presumably, if they tried to revolt, wouldn't be able to remove him. He would be gone, and he'd be able to plot his revenge in the darkness. So if you had the Ring of Gyges, the point isn't just that this shepherd is a bad guy. It's the point is, for Glaucon, we are all bad people, because his prediction is that if you had the Ring of Gyges, you would behave just like the shepherd. You may not immediately try to take over the kingdom, but as we discussed in class, you would begin to indulge in certain wrongdoing. You would begin to pursue your own self-interest at the expense of other people. And as you did that in small ways, it would become tempting to do it in increasingly bigger and bigger and more damaging ways, until, yes, you might eventually become violent and harm other people if it meant getting what you wanted, or even just to get revenge against somebody that you always hated. Glaucon says, 1, that's how you would act. 2, this shows that the only reason you actually refrain from doing these things right now is that you fear reprisal from society. You've been trained over time to know that if you steal, if you murder, if you break laws, or if you just behave cruelly toward people, people will punish you, whether through the law or through other means. The reason why we don't do those things now is that we all know what the consequences are, and we've internalized that and begun to make habits out of treating one another with respect, being moral to one another. Let's let an ROG type situation be a Ring of Gyges type situation. This is any situation which, like the Ring of Gyges, is a situation in which it is in your long-term self-interest to behave unjustly, and in your long-term interests, not in your long-term interests, self-interest, to behave justly. All of the contingent benefits for just or moral behavior and punishments for unjust or immoral behavior are gone. The Ring of Gyges does that in a kind of crude invisibility ring type way, but certainly you could imagine, or don't have to imagine, maybe think about the way people begin to behave when they're in anonymous online spaces. That's a kind of Ring of Gyges type situation. Anonymity grants you this sort of immunity from social repercussions. So here is Glaucon's argument, reconstructed. First premise: no one in a Ring of Gyges type situation would behave morally. Not you, not Gyges of Lydia. Given enough time, not even Martin Luther King or Mother Teresa. If they're human, they will succumb to the temptation of pursuing their self-interest at the expense of other people. Second claim: if we actually are in this actual world, forget about the Ring of Gyges, if we actually are motivated by a desire for justice for its own sake, then we wouldn't act immorally in an ROG type situation. In other words, if it was really justice or morality or the other that we cared about for their own sake, it wouldn't matter what the rewards and benefits were. We would continue our dedication to justice even if we were not rewarded for doing it, or we weren't punished in the event that we strayed from the path of justice. Therefore, we are not actually motivated by a desire for justice or morality for its own sake. His argument is valid, and the two places to push back are, do you buy this prediction about how we would behave in an ROG type situation? And if so, do you agree that this shows that we're not actually motivated by justice?